Welcome to our monthly grand rounds of the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine. My name is Gloria Ye, and I am the Director of Clinical Research at the Osher Center. It's my pleasure to be able to welcome you here this morning on our first grand rounds of the year 2023. So just before I introduce our speaker for this morning, a couple of quick announcements just for those of you who are interested in CME credit for this session. You can email owings@bwh.harvard.edu, and you can see the information in the chat. And also during our presentation, please send us questions for our speaker and use the Q&A function, and we'll be able to take a look at that and pose those questions to the speaker at the end. Okay. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this morning, Dr. Howard Sesso. So we're really thrilled that Dr. Sesso has recently joined us at the Osher Center as our new Director of Nutrition and Supplements Research. And so it's very fitting that he would kick us off as the first Grand Round speaker of 2023. So in addition to his role at the Osher Center, Dr. Sesso also serves as the Associate Director of the Division of Preventive Medicine at BWH, as well as the Director of Nutrition Research and the Co-Director of Hypertension Research within the Division of Preventive Medicine. Dr. Sesso is trained as an epidemiologist and a trialist, and his research expertise spans the prevention of cardiovascular disease, including hypertension and obesity as major risk factors, as well as cancer. And he's led clinical trials focused on the role of vitamin and mineral supplements, along with nutritional biomarkers on the prevention of chronic disease. Dr. Sesso leads multiple large, well-known cohort studies, including the Physician's Health Study of 29,000 men and decades of follow-up that has tested aspirin along with beta-carotene, vitamin E and C, and multivitamins in cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other chronic disease. In the VITAL trial, he's testing vitamin D and fish oil on blood pressure and hypertension risk, and he's also leader of the Cosmos trial, another large study of 21,000 older men and women testing cocoa, flavanol, and multivitamin supplements in the prevention of cardiovascular disease and cancer. His complementary research interests at the Osher Center include lifestyle approaches and other non-pharmacological behavioral interventions to promote healthy diet and nutrition. So please join me in welcoming our speaker for this morning, Dr. Howard Sesso.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Happy New Year to all. Healthy New Year as well to all, and thrilled to be part of the Osher Center community moving forward. And for today, we'll be talking about a topic that I've been involved in for quite a while and have a lot of interest in, and I hope you will as well, with lots of questions toward the end, focusing on dietary supplements and how they link with health outcomes and integrative medicine, and what do we know about the research at this point in time. So just a few disclosures. Much of my work, particularly revolving around the Physician's Health Study 2 and Cosmos trials, as you'll hear about in part, were supported in part from Pfizer Consumer Healthcare, which is now Haleon in terms of pills and packaging, and Mars Edge had provided investigator-initiated grants for support and a donation of pills and packaging as well. So my interest in diet and nutrition actually goes back relatively far. So I am not an artist, I'm a scientist. Let me be clear about that, although someone argue that science and art are intertwined. But I've long been interested in the diet and how do we eat and its implications on health. A lot of this actually had to do with the fact that my father, when he was 39 years old, had his first of several heart attacks. And it was a very early wake-up call to understand, in his case, how nutrition and diet ties in with cardiovascular disease. And those interests have carried forward for me into the work I do today, and it certainly inspires me. Now, we can sit here and talk about the aspects of diet and nutrition and its role in health, but for today, for this morning, I really want to focus on what I would deem to be perhaps even extreme dietary reductionism. There's been a lot of work that I and others have been involved in over the years looking through nutritional epidemiology to identify foods and dietary patterns that might help to reduce major morbidity and mortality. And it's always been believed that there's certain components of the food that we eat or the things that we drink, vitamins, minerals, other nutrients that drive those benefits. For better or for worse, there's always been a question as to whether or not some sort of a dietary supplement can capture those benefits to meaningfully improve health. What's always interesting is that dietary supplement use always increases before the actual research is done. And that's a challenge that we have in this field. And not to literally pick on a strawberry, but as an example, if we think about the strawberry, we assume that it's good for you, but is it the food? Is it something about the food matrix? Or is it the dietary pattern? Is it in combination with the other foods that we eat that it gleans its effects? Or is it a function of like one or two specific nutrients? Or is it a function of other things about people who eat strawberries? So it's difficult for us to glean necessarily whether a food necessarily translates to benefits on health. So I want to start with a step back. What is a dietary supplement? So there's, in 1994, there's the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or DSHEA. And this, for the last almost 3 decades now, has shaped how at least the government defines and manages and oversees dietary supplements. And the way they define a dietary supplement is that it's taken by mouth, has some sort of a dietary ingredient that's going to supplement the diet. It can include a wide array of things: vitamins, minerals, herbs, botanicals, enzymes, amino acids, metabolites. And this can be in many different forms. What's interesting is that from the perspective of the US Food and Drug Administration, these are considered foods. Dietary supplements are somehow considered to be foods, not drugs. And as you can imagine, unlike an antihypertensive medication, a dietary supplement has a different process by which they are evaluated. Now, the other thing to consider is that, for better or for worse, people continue to take dietary supplements. And this is just a snapshot from the early 2000s. No matter what you see with the trials that I'll review in the upcoming session here, supplement use has largely stayed high and stable over time. Whether you look by age, older individuals are more likely to take supplements, no different than on the right panel, where women are more likely to take supplements. Furthermore, if you look at, and this is looking in Haynes data, if you look at the prevalence of dietary supplement use over the past 30 days, and this is looking at a number of different multivitamins and individual supplements, we see that there are very strong differences by age and by sex in terms of who's using what. But it's strongly related to, again, women are more likely, and also with age. So the supplements are used by lots of people. And yet, despite the fact that these are used, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. The governance of dietary supplements is, I wouldn't say it's bad. I wouldn't say it's good. It's somewhere in between. And on the left is EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. This is with regard to European oversight. But to focus on the right side here with the US Food and Drug Administration, there's different types of claims that can go onto dietary supplement bottles or labels. And they could either be on the basis of content, structure, function, or health. Because of the way that DSHEA is set up, the oversight of these claims, I would say, is loosely regulated at best. And to give you a sense of what you will typically see, and I have 2 examples here illustrated here. So Prevagen is one of my favorites, not because I necessarily believe in it, but as a fan of Jeopardy, they have ads every single Jeopardy episode, it seems, for Prevagen, at least 1 or 2. Maybe it's because they're trying to make sure I can remember the first one or the second. But you're able to say lots of things on dietary supplement bottles or labels without the same level of oversight than you would if it were, again, some prescription medication. So some of these claims that you can list, which are overseen by the Food and Drug Administration, include nutrient content claims. So you can basically describe whether you have a lot or a little of a nutrient and compare it to others. You can make structure function claims. This is virtually exclusive to dietary supplements. And this is where it gets a little bit, I would say, nebulous in terms of the oversight. You can say things like calcium builds strong bones. Well, yes. What does that really have to do with the supplement and potential effectiveness or efficacy is a question. Or antioxidants maintain cell integrity. The manufacturer, only the manufacturer is responsible for ensuring the accuracy and truthfulness of these types of claims. And I have this in the blue box here. If you can read it, you get the standard statement that you see on virtually every dietary supplement that this has not been evaluated by the FDA and it's not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Well, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence about whether something actually works. The final example in terms of label claims are what we call qualified health claims. This is where you actually have to submit, the manufacturer has to submit a petition to the Food and Drug Administration to argue and justify through science and studies how a particular food or sorry, a dietary supplement might reduce risk of some outcome. But only a very small proportion of these petitions have been approved. And that's mainly because of the fact that the evidence, as you'll see, has been very scattered with regard to dietary supplements and health outcomes. The difference is that with a qualified health claim, both the manufacturer and the FDA are now responsible for ensuring the validity of these claims. But otherwise, the vast majority of the dietary supplement market is surrounding the nutrient content and the structure function claims, where there is virtually no oversight. The other thing to think about, so, why dietary supplements, but also from my own research over the years, clinical trials actually have a unique role in assessing the effects of dietary supplements in ways that go beyond the observational data, as you'll see. But also, when we think about clinical trials, there's two ways you can approach the results of clinical trial. There's what we call efficacy, which is the ideal circumstances where every participant in a trial accepts the intervention, they take it, they get the best care. And in these types of trials, you do what we call intention to treat analyses. It eliminates confounding because that's what we do with a randomized trial. In contrast, in the real world, we know that not everyone takes a pill that they're given. They might drop out of the study. They might not have access to care in the way we'd like to see that. These are what we call real world or effectiveness trials, where we can analyze the data where as a per protocol or as treated or compliance-based analysis that introduces confounding. But in reality, with any clinical trial that we conduct, you really want to try and analyze, in my view, the data both ways within a single trial, because it allows you to look at both ideal circumstances and ordinary circumstances to evaluate what the role of a particular dietary supplement is on health outcomes. And so this is where dietary supplements do have advantages over, let's just say, a dietary intervention, which could be much more complicated. You have the ability to do placebo control. It's a pure comparison of taking versus not taking a particular supplement. It's a very simple intervention. Efficacy is more likely as well in a smaller short-term trial. Of course, with a longer-term trial that you're doing that's measured in months or even years, it's almost impossible to maintain 100% compliance or to avoid any loss to follow-up. And you start to introduce potential side effects and safety concerns and interactions with other supplements or medications that are actually an underappreciated area of dietary supplement research. And so what we are left with typically in evaluating the science of dietary supplements is what we call the implementation gap. This difference somewhere in between efficacy and effectiveness is what we get from the trials, and trying to apply that in a public health setting, as you'll see, in dietary guidelines regarding or guidelines surrounding dietary supplements is actually quite nebulous. So what I'd like to do is just give a very brief overview of some of the work I and others within our group here at the Division of Preventive Medicine at the Brigham have been involved in and are aware of with regard to some of the common dietary supplements with regard to cardiovascular disease and cancer outcomes as a start. Beta-carotene is a classic example, and I'm not going to go through all the studies here, other than to say that beta-carotene was popular back in the 80s and 90s. Lots of big trials were done. The bottom line is that there's really very little evidence to support beta-carotene supplementation in cardiovascular disease through a number of different studies that were done. In fact, there's a potential increased risk, as you'll see. Vitamin E was another supplement that kind of hit the bandwidth, so to speak, in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And lots of studies, well-conducted clinical trials have been done testing different doses or amounts and durations of vitamin E supplementation with regard to not only cardiovascular disease, but many other major morbidity endpoints. Bottom line with vitamin E as well is that the evidence is largely equivocal. There were some suggestions of benefits here and there, and maybe even some suggestions of risk, but bottom line is that overall, there's really no evidence to support vitamin E supplementation in cardiovascular disease and other major morbidity. Other trials have also considered trying to combine at least a few selected vitamins and minerals. In this instance, from this chart, vitamin E, vitamin C, beta-carotene, and selenium were often combined in different ways across many different large-scale, long-term clinical trials, both in the primary and secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease. And again, the evidence was largely equivocal. Potential benefit, potential risk, no effect, maybe an increase in mortality. But it speaks to an issue that we have, of course, thinking about this issue of dietary reductionism. As much as we know that diet, a nice diverse diet matters, trying to whittle it down to individual nutrients often becomes problematic, especially in the context of a clinical trial where you have the ability to eliminate confounding and look at the actual effect that it has on different outcomes. Another supplement that has become popular as of late and continuing to be is vitamin D. And so, there are unique risk factors for low vitamin D living in the northern latitudes or southern latitudes below 37 South. For example, avoidance of the sun, dark skin pigmentation, older age, lots of observational data. This is the typical kind of run-up that we see for lots of individual vitamins and minerals or even bioactives that get put into a supplemental form with the idea that these must work. But the advantage again of clinical trials is that these can look to truly put these to the test and see if they do or don't. And in fact, our research group led by Dr. Joanne Manson and Julie Buring and others here in the Division of Preventive Medicine conducted the VITAL trial, the vitamin D and omega-3 trial, which was a 5-year trial testing in a 2x2 factorial fashion, nearly 26,000 initially healthy men and women, middle-aged and older. And they were randomized to either take 2,000 IUD or a placebo, or omega-3 fatty acids, a mix of EPA and DHA versus placebo, looking at a number of different endpoints, not just total cancer and major cardiovascular disease, but also a number of different ancillary studies as well. And just to summarize this very briefly, when looking at the vitamin D results, there is no overall effect on the primary endpoint of total cancer, invasive cancer of any type. There's also a co-primary endpoint of cardiovascular disease for which this hazard ratio of 0.97 would indicate that there's no overall effect. But like anything else, when you start to look at these data more comprehensively, there's always a little bit more of a story to be told. And we know that in particular subgroups as well as other groups that there could be stronger effects for vitamin D. And so with these trials that we've conducted here over the years, the main finding is important, but also what you get from all the supplemental findings and ancillary studies around it are equally important to guide further research in this area. Because in fact, it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all proposition with any dietary supplement in health. We know that there are particularly, if there are benefits or risks, it's usually going to be confined to particular subgroups of interest. So it was not just a vitamin D trial, but also omega-3 trial, omega-3 fatty acids. Just wanted to highlight the fact here that for cardiovascular disease, the primary major endpoint of CVD, there was no overall effect for omega-3 fatty acids and cardiovascular disease in VITAL. But again, total myocardial infarction, there was actually a 28% reduction. It's a secondary outcome. And then we also found have seen that for other subgroups, for example, that there could be also benefits as well, and that work continues. What I'd like to do is actually kind of get away from some of the individual vitamin and mineral supplements and focus on an area that I've been long interested in, which are multivitamin and multimineral formulations. The reason for this is that multivitamins are the most commonly used dietary supplement in the United States, by far. About 30, depending on the age and who you're selecting, it can be as high as 50, 60%. Especially in older adults. And if you go to any store, whether it's a CVS or a Walgreens or wherever you might consider purchasing a supplement, it's confusing. It's overwhelming, to be perfectly honest, not just for multivitamins, but the number of products and for from the consumer or patient standpoint, to identify what they should buy is a challenge in and of itself. And for multivitamins in particular, that section of any store shelves alone takes up a whole bunch of space. And it's because there are tons of different formulations. There's different combinations and amounts of vitamins, minerals, and bioactives in each of the multivitamins that you might consider purchasing. The target populations differ. You have like the Flintstones type of chewable vitamins for children, and then you have different supplements for men, for women, for older adults. And then you have targeted outcomes. It might be for immune function, which was a big thing during the pandemic, for bone health, for eye health, for cardiovascular health. And as a result of it, trying to come up with uniform recommendations or guidelines, or even just basic guidance, it's almost impossible to formulate when there's so much out there to choose from. And from a research standpoint, it's even more difficult to test it. Furthermore, if you look at some of the trials that have been conducted over the years on multivitamins and health outcomes, there is no uniform multivitamin that's been tested. So you'll learn about some of these in the upcoming slides, but again, whether it's which vitamin or mineral is included, to what amount, you see differences for each of these. There's very little uniformity. And in fact, as you'll see, as I'm describing these last two columns on the right, the Physicians Health Study 2 and Cosmos trials, for which I was involved in each, even this was the same product. It was a Centrum Silver product that's targeting adults 50 and up. Even that specific multivitamin formulation changes over time. Sometimes they increase the vitamin D, or they'll increase the vitamin E just a touch, or they might decrease, for example, the phosphorus. Or so the question becomes challenging. Is it everything in combination that's driving any potential benefits, or is it driven by individual nutrients? It gets into this dietary reductionism question again. But even for an individual supplement, that alone changes over time. So this makes it even more difficult to evaluate from a research perspective. So just a few examples of the earlier multivitamin trials. This was a trial that was done in more than 3,000 men and women in China that were living with the diagnosis of esophageal squamous dysplasia. They were given a multivitamin that had 26 different vitamins and minerals, 6 years of treatment, no effect on mortality, but then after 20 years of post-trial follow-up, no effect. The thing that is interesting here that I wanted to point out, though, is that it seemed as though, and there was really no explanation for this at the time, that it seemed like men actually might have benefited a little bit more than women, that the effect might have been confined to men, and that the effect might have been confined to older individuals, perhaps, in terms of mortality. And you'll see this come up with some of the other data that I'll show you. Another trial that was done is what's called the Supermax study. I don't speak French, so I'm not going to try that. But yet at the same time, this was an important trial because this was a primary prevention trial, placebo-controlled. The problem with Supermax is that it's perceived to be a multivitamin, but it barely is. It only has vitamin C, vitamin E, beta-carotene, selenium, and zinc in combination as a single daily capsule. And it gets into the question again is what constitutes a multivitamin and what should go into it? What amounts of each of these the vitamins and minerals should be included in it? But for Supermax, it was a long study. It was about 7.5 years. They maintained pretty high compliance. Primary outcomes were focused around cardiovascular disease and cancer, with a secondary outcome of all-cause mortality. And again, what they had found overall, so if you look, for example, at total ischemic cardiovascular disease, there's no overall effect. There are suggestions up here, a relative risk of 0.82, that there could be some differences, perhaps, in men versus women again. If you looked at cancer, again, no overall effect, a relative risk that was not statistically significant of 0.90, but there was evidence of an interaction with sex. There seemed to be a benefit in men and not in women for taking this more limited multivitamin in Supermax. Similarly, this was also seen for total mortality. There was, it was not quite significant, but there's a suggestion that there could be benefits on mortality for their more limited multivitamin, but the effect was stronger in men, once again, consistent with the Cognition data, as you'll see in these other data too. So next is the Physicians Health Study 2 trial. This is a trial that was I had conducted with Dr. Mike Gaziano here at the Brigham. This was actually it was not just a multivitamin trial, it was a trial that also tested individual supplements of vitamin E, C, and beta-carotene. We'll steer clear of those and focus on the multivitamin piece. This was a long trial. It was 11 years of treatment and follow-up. It was limited to men aged 50 and up. Major cardiovascular disease and total cancer events were the primary endpoints. And again, even in this trial, we maintained relatively high compliance. About, by the end of the trial, this is 11 years in, 2/3 of the men were still taking these the multivitamin supplement. But again, this is a little bit more of a truer multivitamin. And what we saw for total cancer was that, again, after about 11 years of follow-up, it was borderline significant, but there was a potentially significant 8% reduction in total cancer for those men taking the multivitamin compared to placebo. And this was consistent across some of the other individual cancer endpoints. What we also saw is that the oldest men, aged 70 and up, seemed to have even greater benefits for taking a multivitamin versus placebo, an 18% reduction. As well. Like any good trial, this leads to another. And so the Physicians Health Study 2 trial in part led to another trial that we recently completed called the Cocoa Supplement and Multivitamin Outcome Study, or COSMOS. So this was a trial of more than 21,000 older men and women around the US that were free of CVD and recently diagnosed cancer. We're going to focus initially here on the multivitamin results. This trial lasted about 3.5 years. And as much as we were hoping to see a repeat of what we had seen in the Physicians Health Study 2 for cancer, as well as what we saw in Supermax among men, as well as the Lynchian data, we found that there was no evidence for taking a multivitamin on total invasive cancer, not just overall in the COSMOS trial in men and women, but the results were identical for men and women separately. So we weren't able to replicate those findings. Furthermore, we also, but again, this is where it's always interesting looking through the data. We did see some suggestions of a reduction in invasive lung cancer for taking the multivitamin versus placebo. This hazard ratio of 0.62, which corresponds to a 38% reduction. It's a secondary outcome, so we're not placing great emphasis on it. But the magnitude of effect is, in fact, actually relatively close to what we saw in the Physicians Health Study, where that hazard ratio, which you did not see in the previous slide, was 0.84. So that was a non-significant 16% reduction in PHS-2. Nevertheless, one thing I also wanted to highlight in this COSMOS trial is that we also looked at cocoflavanols, which is a bioactive component found not just in the cocoa bean, but in other food sources such as wine, berries, and other foods, healthy foods. And just to highlight this concept what I had shown before of intention to treat versus per protocol analyses. If we ran COSMOS from the perspective of intention to treat analyses, we see that for the primary outcome of total cardiovascular disease, there was a non-statistically significant 10% reduction in cardiovascular disease comparing cocoflavanols versus placebo. However, if we consider the per protocol analyses, what's the impact of compliance? So if we censored people during the trial, so I might start the trial, a year in, I decide I don't like taking the supplement. Maybe it's side effects. Maybe it's just uncomfortable taking it. Maybe it's difficult to take, or I had other things going on. But if you censor the data, what we found is that that hazard ratio went from a 10% non-significant reduction to a 15% significant reduction in total cardiovascular disease. Now, does this prove that cocoflavanols reduce cardiovascular events? No. It raises the issue of the importance of replication of results, for one. But for two, again, thinking about this implementation gap and the differences in how we can even analyze clinical trial data, particularly for dietary supplements, I think is a very important issue that we need to address in more detail moving forward. So one thing that was nice about COSMOS in particular is that we had several studies that were focused around brain health. We had different ways through which we not only collected blood, but we also collected data on cognition. And what I'd like to present to you is some of our initial results, not just for COSMOS, but across these other large-scale trials on brain health, and argue that I think there's actually a lot of potential for thinking about dietary supplements in the context of brain health. So in results that were published earlier last year, now that it's 2023, one of our studies called Cosmos Mind did a telephone-based cognitive assessment. And this was in more than 2,000 participants at baseline, and then again at 1, 2, and 3 years follow-up. And what we found was that there was a significant improvement in cognition from participants who were taking the multivitamin versus placebo. And if you were to extrapolate these data, it suggested that a multivitamin, such as Centrum, would appear to slow cognitive aging by about 50% over 3 years. Now, what's interesting about these data is that you can see that whether you're in the blue active group or the red placebo group, both groups improved. And so one of the issues or challenges in cognitive research is, of course, this learning effect. If you take a test once, and then you take again, there's maybe some carryover effect. But even after accounting for this learning effect, those in the multivitamin group still improved further than those in the placebo group. What's interesting about this finding is that if you look across the other trials that either I or others have been involved in looking at not just multivitamins, but other dietary supplements and cognition, there's an interesting limitation that has never been addressed. So I'm going to go back one slide for a moment to highlight the fact that this was a trial in Cosmos Mind. These data were analyzed where we had everyone provide a baseline assessment of cognition, and then over a up to 3-year period of follow-up, we see this potential beneficial effect. We had also analyzed this question in the Physicians' Health Study 2. We had almost 6,000 male physicians that were aged 65 and up. They did a telephone-based cognitive assessment that were done up to 4 times over 12 years of follow-up. What's interesting is that we didn't find an effect for a multivitamin on cognition, no significant effects, either for a global composite score or looking at some of the other individual components of it. But there's a major limitation that I think still needs to be thought through more deeply, which is that the way this trial was designed and the cognitive study was designed, the first cognitive assessment was not done until about 2.5 years after randomization. So the treatment effect that we saw in Cosmos would be almost impossible to replicate if, depends on that trajectory, if in fact a multivitamin improves cognition over time. So this is a major limitation that I've highlighted in blue, and this comes up repeatedly in a lot of the studies that our group has done. The reason for that, the challenge with doing clinical trials is that you put all this effort into getting the funding, getting them started, whether big or small, and then you realize all the things you want to collect. And not just the Physicians' Health Study 2, but even also in the Women's Health Study, another large trial cohort that we do out of the Division of Preventive Medicine. This is a great study. We had more than 6,000 women aged 65 and up. This is focused on the vitamin E component of the Women's Health Study, looking at 600 IUs every other day, looking at a very similar panel of telephone-based cognitive assessments. The problem, again, is that the first assessments were begun more than 5 years after randomization. So there was no significant effects found for either a global score or some of the individual components of cognition here. Now, this might very well be true. Vitamin E might do nothing. But the problem has been in a lot of the studies that have been published that we might be waiting too long. These might be more immediate effects that persist as opposed to a very delayed effect that we're missing. Another trial that was done within our group called the WAX trial was looking at many different supplements, and this one was looking at things in combination, looking at vitamin E, C, and beta-carotene supplementation. These were older women either with or at high risk for cardiovascular disease. Again, they did 4 telephone-based assessments over about 5 to 6 years. That's great. The problem, again, is that the first assessment didn't begin until 3.5 years into the trial. So if there are benefits for dietary supplements, we don't know whether we still have no idea whether they're early stage benefits that persist. That's something that has been missed in these data, unfortunately. Even within the Physicians' Health Study 2, we also looked at beta-carotene and cognitive function in men. Here, there's a unique advantage with the Physicians' Health Study 2 data in that this was originally there was originally a Physicians' Health Study 1 trial that began even earlier in time. What was interesting in these data was that when we look at beta-carotene in particular, that if you look at on the right panel here for table 4, if you're able to read this, the point here is that beta-carotene supplementation actually has some suggested benefits over placebo in terms of improvements in cognitive performance with long-term treatment assignments. So for all those other trials that I've been showing you where the long-term benefits might not be persisting, in PHS2, there might be some suggestions of benefits for beta-carotene supplementation. So I think there's a lot more work that has to be done in this area. Now, interestingly, in the VITAL trial, they also looked at changes in cognition over time as well. Again, looking at vitamin D supplementation and omega-3 fatty acids. It's hard to read these tables. I'm not asking you to do so, but these were more recently published. What's nice about VITAL is that they had 2 groups in which they actually did telephone-based and/or in-person cognitive assessments right at baseline at the point of randomization, pre-randomization. So I have a lot more faith in these data with regard to vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids, both of which found that there was no significant effect for either of these particular supplements on changes in cognition over a several-year period of time. So again, the design of a study matters, especially when we think about it in the context of brain health. So, I think there are other important considerations that apply not just to dietary supplements and cognition, but more broadly thinking about integrative medicine, which is that what is the role of baseline nutritional status? What is it in the context of dietary factors that you can measure at baseline, as well as biomarkers that are more objective assessments of dietary function or dietary status? We still need to understand what the viable mechanisms of effect are. We know much less about brain health than we do for cardiovascular disease and cancer, and understanding how dietary supplements fit into that from a mechanistic standpoint. A lot of work needs to be done in that area. A lot of work is beginning to be done in that area. The clinical trial design, again, really matters. As I've highlighted, the baseline cognitive assessments really need to be at the time of randomization at the trial, a pre-randomization evaluation, and trying to account better for this learning effect that we typically see for repeated assessments over time. But nevertheless, I do think that dietary supplements and cognition represent a very promising area for research that extends into other areas of integrative medicine as well. So I'd like to speak just briefly about herbal supplements, only because these are almost, as much as we pay attention to the vitamins and minerals and bioactives, the herbal supplements, I would say, are less accounted for from a research standpoint, and actually offer a very good opportunity for future research. We know that about 20% of US adults use herbal supplements of some type, but the number that actually tell their physicians about using is actually quite low relative to vitamins and minerals. And we also see, like we see for other vitamin and mineral supplements, that the prevalence of herbal supplement use increases when you have more risk factors and medical conditions. And these are just a few examples of some of the commonly used herbal supplements. But on the table on the right, I think the thing that's, again, a very underappreciated aspect of dietary supplements more broadly is that, again, if you're taking herbal supplements, you're also going to be more likely to be using other vitamin and mineral supplements and also using prescription drugs. And one thing that has been underappreciated over time are the potential interactions between not just the supplements, but the supplements with the prescription medications on different health outcomes. We don't regularly track these data in a systematic fashion. And so that becomes very problematic. You think about, again, the prescription medications, there's kind of post-approval tracking that takes place to identify potential issues that arise. We don't have that same level of oversight with the dietary supplements. Furthermore, when we think about herbal supplements, there are not that many clinical trials that have been done. Comparatively, I've been presenting these very large-scale clinical trials of vitamin and mineral supplements. You just don't have the equivalent strength of evidence for the herbal supplements. And furthermore, you have a lot of methodologic and logistical issues that arrive that I think hamper the progress in understanding the effects of herbal supplements. The simple question of what's a placebo? The duration of follow-up, they tend to be shorter. And then these safety concerns that often arise. And just as an example of a nice study that was recently published, this is looking at the comparative effects of different dietary supplements, some of which include some of the herbals, on lipids and inflammatory biomarkers. This was a relatively short study, just a few weeks in duration, comparing it against a standard lipid-lowering therapy that is going to work, placebo. But whether it's fish oil, cinnamon, garlic, turmeric, plant sterols, red yeast, rice, very little evidence to really show that these things actually work in well-conducted clinical trials. So what I'd like to do is just pivot a little bit and speak about dietary supplement recommendations. You've seen all these data, but how has this been translated to dietary supplement recommendations? There's really very little out there that specifically targets dietary supplements. If you look at the dietary guidelines for Americans, their comments, and I think rightfully so, focus on nutrient needs being met from nutrient-dense foods, because we know that if you have the food, that's always going to be your best bet. And this talk, as much as I'm discussing dietary supplements, should not take away from the importance of the need for a healthy diet and a healthy dietary pattern. But I think the dietary guidelines for Americans, again, even in the more recent 2020 recommendations, again, reemphasize the idea that nutritional needs need to be met primarily from foods and beverages. That's the first line of defense when we think about diet, nutrition, and health. Supplements may or may not have a role beyond that. And that's where it gets tricky in terms of recommendations versus actual practice that the patients are doing. If you look at another group, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, here they make at least a little bit more of a stretch in terms of arguing that micronutrient supplements may be warranted when requirements are not being met through diet alone. And that there could be certain individuals that have greater requirements, whether it's growth or chronic disease or medications and other issues, or who might be at particular risk for inadequate dietary intake. But they still would argue, correctly so, that the routine and indiscriminate use of micronutrient supplements for the prevention of chronic disease is not recommended given the lack of available scientific evidence. Now, most recently, in 2022, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force had generated and actually updated their recommendations with regard to dietary supplements and cardiovascular disease, cancer, and mortality. They don't address brain health. They don't address the myriad of other outcomes and that we ought to be thinking about. So they focus just on a few. And they ask several key questions, kind of re-asking these questions and looking and grading the evidence about it. And quite simply, their evidence, honestly, these statements that first came out about a decade ago, which really, honestly, I would say the recommendations are largely the same as they were. They didn't really update much other than a few new trials, such as those that our group have been involved in their new recommendations. And so, the things that they did say is that they recommend against the use of beta-carotene or vitamin E supplements for prevention of CVD, cardiovascular disease, or cancer. But otherwise, for the vast majority of individual supplements or a multivitamin, the evidence remains insufficient. They said the evidence was insufficient about 10 years ago, and they're still saying it is. And so that's frustrating, not because they did a bad job on this, but rather for the individual patient. How do we treat the patient? What do we recommend to the patient? We're still kind of left in this nebulous middle space about, we go to the supermarket or other places, we see supplements everywhere, but we still don't have enough evidence to support whether we should or shouldn't take them. And as they put their recommendations together, again, like any other group, they're going to do a meta-analysis summarizing the evidence that's there. What's interesting is that for the multivitamin evidence in particular, and this is combining Cosmos, the Physician's Health Study 2, and two of the other trials, they did actually suggest that there was a significant 7% reduction for taking a multivitamin on any cancer. They didn't put this into their recommendations, not because they were ignoring it or because they're wrong, but again, 7% doesn't sound like a lot, if it's true, of course. But 7% reduction in cancer from a public health standpoint actually has dramatic effects. That's not to say that we should be, but we still need to better understand the effects of a multivitamin on cancer in particular. Again, they looked at the evidence across a number of different supplements, and as you can see from these summary odds ratios here, they tend to hover all around that middle line of an odds ratio of 1 where it's largely equivocal. The unfortunate part of the recommendation, though, is that there are elements still, there are particular groups that still might benefit more from supplements, whether it's on the basis of race, ethnicity, or initial dietary status, or specific outcomes or history of outcomes that we still need to better target through not just the trials that I've been involved in, but through the other data that are out there. So there's more work to be done. The other thing with U.S. Preventive Services Task Force is that they did try to address the issues of safety and generalizability. And we haven't talked about safety too much in this talk, and I think it's an important aspect of dietary supplements. Given the way that they're regulated, we don't necessarily have the level of security that we do in terms of exactly what you're getting, what the amount is, whether there's any kind of contamination per se. Going with the main brands, the primary brands, the common brands is usually your better bet, but still, we don't know. But they still did argue that for many vitamins and nutrients, there is little evidence of serious harm. So that's good. But still, excessive doses of anything still could cause adverse effects. For beta-carotene, their grading of a D was largely on the basis of an increased risk of lung cancer for taking a beta-carotene supplement for those who have smoked or have had occupational exposure to asbestos. Not everyone smokes. So as I showed you that beta-carotene cognition data, how does that factor into this? So we still need to learn more. But the recommendation does apply broadly to community-dwelling non-pregnant adults, but it doesn't apply to children, people who are pregnant or may become pregnant, people who are ill, hospitalized, or have a known nutritional deficiency. As an example, if you look among cancer patients, about 70% of cancer patients actually take a multivitamin supplement. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, obviously in terms of the context of treatments, but how does that fit into the big picture? And the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force does separately recommend that everyone who's planning to or capable of getting pregnant or wants to become pregnant or has become pregnant take basically a multivitamin, a prenatal or a multivitamin that contains folic acid. What's interesting is that even that is not on the basis of specific trials per se. In Europe, the rates of supplement use in those who are intending to be pregnant or pregnant is actually much less than what you see in the United States, where here it's like about 95%. There are other areas that the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force highlighted for research needs and gaps, certainly emphasizing that studies need to be of sufficient duration to detect an effect for all these different supplements on not just CVD and cancer outcomes, but other health outcomes that surround integrative medicine. It's unclear about vitamin D and cancer mortality. There was evidence in Vital and other data suggest that vitamin D might benefit cancer mortality. Again, you need long-term studies to do this, especially for mortality endpoints. Again, they also emphasize the fact that there's heterogeneity or differences across specific populations or by baseline nutrient levels, also considering things like food insecurity. And this is particularly true in the context of multivitamin supplementation, I would argue. Multivitamins, whether good or whether they work or not, are at least a low-cost potential public health strategy that ought to be considered, perhaps in certain subgroups. And especially if we know that there are those that have deficiencies or low prevalence, or in certain populations, you can argue this is even more important. We know that multivitamins are one tool. There are other tools that go beyond that. Just getting access to healthcare is an important issue in of itself, of course. But again, these guidelines are still limited. Their guardrails were very high with regard to, they're focused on CVD, cancer, and mortality. There are many other outcomes that we think about for dietary supplements that have yet to be fully vetted and understood. Beyond the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, you hear all the time about precision medicine, precision nutrition, personalized nutrition. I'm not going to dive too heavily into this, other than to focus on the fact that we know that genetics does come into play when we think about how do we target precision nutrition or personalized nutrition approaches to health. We know that there are some individuals that might benefit more or less for vitamin E supplementation and cancer outcomes or other outcomes for that regard. But this is an important tool moving forward when we think about dietary supplement research and how do we apply it. Another way that we can think about precision nutrition is the microbiome. One nice thing is that in the Cosmos trial, we collected in several hundred participants fecal samples from which we can learn more about the gut microbiome and understand more about how, at least in the context of not just the randomized interventions in Cosmos, but other dietary factors and other factors, how does the gut microbiome factor into health? And so this is another area, and this has been highlighted in these two papers that I have here. When we think about a whole person and we think about nutrition and diet and lifestyle, and everything that rolls around with it. The microbiome is another tool that we're now starting to understand its role in the context of health. Just two final slides. One is that just from my own experience over the years, whenever you're doing research in dietary supplements, particularly when you're doing clinical trials, I've always felt it to be a no-win proposition, and not because I say no-win in the context of whether the results will be favorable or not. I mean, we do research because we have true equipoise. We don't know whether they work, and we want to figure out whether it does. If you do a trial, in my experience, if you have favorable results, right? So it's favorable is usually perceived as some degree of efficacy or effectiveness. People are very quick to your camp to say, hey, this is why we do these trials, and this is all the observational studies that were done have always supported it. You tested the right supplement, you had the right amount, you eliminated, obviously, its intention to treat, you know, randomization, eliminated confounding, had the right endpoints. I'd still argue, what analyses did you consider? No differently than when you do these trials and you get, we'll call it an unfavorable result. Let's say there's no effect of a dietary supplement on a health outcome, or whatever. People are very quick to say, oh, clinical trials don't work. You know, all the observational studies, they're all flawed by confounding. You were forced to test a single supplement, the wrong dose, the wrong population, you had the wrong endpoints, you just did everything wrong, and that's why, you know, and ultimately, when you're reporting the results from trials, it's a bit of a no-win proposition. I say this not to uninspire you from doing this type of work, but rather to appreciate that when you're doing a clinical trial, the design matters and how you approach it matters from the very start, and not just the result you get out of it. So to finish up, when I think about dietary supplements and integrative medicine for the road ahead, we know that dietary supplements really involve a very complex multi-system dynamic that are the hallmarks of integrative medicine. Taking supplements is not just a function of effect, it's a function of body, mind, and spirit. There are so many lingering questions around supplement research more broadly. Why do people take them in the first place? Why do they start? Why do they continue? The perception of a supplement in health is interesting, the psychology of it. Can dietary supplements improve health outcomes, not just cardiovascular disease and cancer and all these other things, brain health, all these other areas of health? How can we optimally evaluate efficacy and safety of supplements? And what are the roles of supplements, if at all, for individual patients and more broadly for public health? Again, I think it starts with the design of these trials, so we can at least address potential efficacy. I would argue that the design of a trial probably matters as much, if not more, than the outcome. And ideally, you want to have a diverse representative population, and you have to be very thoughtful about what you're testing. Because once you start testing something, you can't reverse your decision. Ideally, you want to do more what I call hybrid clinical trials. These are hard to initiate, but critically needed, where you're leveraging existing studies to recruit. You might be interested in clinical outcome, but you want to build in the mechanisms of effect into your design. So you have kind of the longer term goal as well as the shorter term outcomes that you're also equally interested in, to try and build those all together in some systematic fashion. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time and attention. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, Happy New Year, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sesso. That was amazing, and you've really touched on so many important aspects, of this conversation. So we have many questions in just a few minutes. So let me just get started. So I think you touched on safety for sure, and there are a couple questions here regarding sort of why is that guardrail so high? Somebody talked about how they hear on the TV advertisements, the list of side effects from medications, and how does the FDA go ahead and approve that and it seems like maybe supplements are potentially less dangerous, and you can comment on that. So why is that guardrail so high, and maybe how can we go forward in terms of trying to do a better job of studying that aspect?
Yeah, safety is a lingering issue with the supplement industry. You usually hear more things about harm potentially for particular supplements than benefit. Not that there's necessarily benefit to report, but to me, it starts with Duchesne's. This law was put into place. It's very loosely regulated. there are lots of forces at play in the dietary supplement industry. I wouldn't say everyone's got good intentions, but the way that they implement and oversee it differ. So whether it's industry, the way they govern themselves versus the research community and how they look to put together the resources or put together the studies to highlight potential risk, even the reporting systems that are in place. If you learn of an adverse event associated with the dietary supplement, there are ways that it can be reported, but how those data are actually going to be brought forth is a whole other issue too. So to me, it's an area of research that's underappreciated and really needs to expand out in different directions to improve for all the supplements we take, not just for the ones that we want to literally pick on. So I think it's something that we really need to do a better job as a scientific community and as a clinical community to address.
Yeah. So you mentioned DSHEA, so the Dietary, the Dietary and Supplements Health and Education Act of 1994. It's quite old. So do we have anything on the horizon that's going to be the, DSHEA number 2 or the next generation of those regulations?
Yeah, I mean, these are always a function of political winds, which we know can blow in many different directions at once. There has been talk over the last decade or so about the need to update them in some fashion. Of course, trying to get everyone to agree to how those should be updated is a matter of debate. The one thing that does come up a lot is the question of the FDA's oversight of dietary supplements. There's no way that DSHEAs would ever be amended to force every single dietary supplement maker to treat their supplement as if it is a prescription medication and demonstrate that it has effects before it can come to market. So we're stuck in this very large gray zone of how can DSHEAs really be updated and upgraded in a way that will check all the boxes. I think it's going to end up having to be a much more incremental approach over time to improve kind of the health claims process through the FDA, as well as how do you define a food versus a supplement. It's a very fine line for all these issues. And it's such a big challenge, big problem, that's no simple solution. No simple DSHEAs 2 will solve that. I think it's going to have to be incremental.
Yeah. Okay, let me just move on to another question. Somebody had a question regarding if you could comment on like the traditional Chinese medicine approach, maybe to herbs and supplements, where there's a multiple herbal herbs in one formulation, and sort of how that's studied and how that's marketed.
Yeah, I think, and I didn't really touch upon that too much in my talk. It's again, Western versus Eastern medicine, or however you like to define it. The basic issue is that we know that there are so many plants and aspects of nature that we know there are medicinal properties. It's really what it comes down to. A lot of what I focused here is on vitamins and minerals, kind of the essential vitamins and minerals. And of course, there are other bioactive components of foods, but we know that there, and through history, through time, there are lots of different ways by which we can manage health and health outcomes. The challenge has been for some of the herbs and medicinals that we just don't have the quality science to support it in a way that we can really demonstrate whether they work or not. It's not that they don't work, but the challenge is trying to design the studies that can actually test whether they do work, or at least use that as building blocks to formally put them into the list of options for doctors or patients to consider.
Yeah, so many considerations here. Thinking about, we have one question here. I don't know if you can say really something very quickly about just formulations, particularly the vitamin E study. I think the question was regarding maybe those studies using synthetic alpha tocopherol instead of, multiple tocopherols. And so I think, that's a question. And then the genomics might be a question. And, like so many different age, gender, so many different areas to sort of consider. But anyways, can you maybe comment on the formulation?
Yeah, I mean, vitamin E is a good example of that. I see this in the Q&A as well. I think, synthetic versus natural vitamin E is a real issue. I mean, most of the trials that I was presenting were on synthetic vitamin E. And so there's a belief that that is, not necessarily what you get if you were to consume vitamin E from nuts and other food sources. So you're really kind of testing two separate things. It's kind of a synthetic vitamin E analog versus getting it from the food. So it's that, again, it's this dietary reductionism that happens with supplement research, which is great for a clinical trial design and a placebo-controlled trial, but it comes at the expense of getting away from what the food-based intervention would be if it were the equivalent. And so I think it's definitely an important limitation that we still have to really understand better through the research that we do.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Sesso. We could continue, I think, this conversation for another hour or two, probably, with all these great points that you've brought up, but we are out of time. So I want to thank you again for being our first Grand Round Speaker of the Year. A couple announcements before we log off. So the first is that our Osher pilot grant letter of intents are due January 15th. And so if you're interested in applying for that, please take a look at our website, oshercenter.org, for more information. And then our Grand Rounds speaker, or a set of speakers for next month on February 7th will be our colleagues from the University of Vermont. And they're going to be doing a case on creating an integrative and effective and financially sustainable program for individuals with chronic pain, experience and outcomes at the University of Vermont. And that's Dr. John Porter and Dr. Joshua Plavin. So please join us next month for our Grand Rounds. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and Happy New Year. And we'll see you next month.